everyone, welcome to my talk, which is titled Student Stewardship in the Classroom. Stewardship is an ethical value, and it has to do with caretaking of oneself and of the resources around you. In this context, I want to help students feel empowered to take care of their own education and feel like they can speak up about how and what we teach them. If students feel empowered to make changes in their education, I believe that moving forward, they will feel like they are caretakers of whatever is under their purview. Going off this ethical value, I think that stewardship is important for students, and I think it's important for everybody, including presidents. I mean, think about it. You literally start out as a student at the Navy Nuclear Power School, and you can end up president of the United States. Now, former nuclear officer / President Jimmy Carter may not have known when he was at Annapolis that he'd be president one day. But our students don't necessarily know what's going to be what they're going to do later on in their lives either. But nonetheless, this concept of being able to take care of the things that you want to take care of is important throughout your educational career and beyond. So, how did young Ensign Hawke come to think about stewardship? Well, by teaching at that very same Navy nuclear power school that Jimmy Carter went to. Sort of. Since he predates me by about 60 years, let's talk about my actual power school students. I actually taught enlisted students, so these are the students that are going to go on to be technicians on either submarines or aircraft carriers. For a little bit of context for you all, the reactor is in the back third of a submarine, and all submarines that belong to the United States that are currently active are nuclear powered. Now, when I actually went onto the USS Rhode Island for the first time, I saw what happened, what the outcome for my students were, basically. Like I met these people when they were students, and here they were actually being technicians on the boat. And I found that these former power school students had a high degree of personal agency by the time they got out to sea. Right, so I'm sitting in the back third of that boat and I'm watching the reactor operator do his work. The amount of technical knowledge that he had and the amount of care that he had for doing his job right was really impressive. So basically what I did is I taught them some technical skills that they then applied to maintain the security, safety, and operations of the submarine. And of course, as a cryptographer, I really care about security and safety while still maintaining operations. Moving into the second part of my talk now that I've told you a little bit about my history, I'm currently teaching a CS1 class, which is an introduction to computer science using Java. And one way that I've been able to have students participate more in their learning process is by having students help write the exam, which, by the way, was never a thing that I could do at Power School. So let me talk you through my process of having these students write the exams. There is a procedure that I followed. I had my students do Cornell notes. If you are not familiar, Cornell notes have a very particular structure. So I would have my students watch a video or do some reading, and their assignment was literally to make a page of Cornell notes out of it. So they would fill in the notes column, they would fill in the summary column, but most important to me is the fact that Cornell notes have you write questions that reflect on the material that you've just gone over. This causes students to have to interact with their learning more so than if they're just taking screenshots or even just writing notes based on what I'm saying. And then especially importantly, now for me, for their assignment, the really important part is that I can look at the cues and questions column and I can ask, can those questions that they took on those notes be transformed into exam questions? Which, by the way, was something I also told my students about, that I was going to look at these questions and try to determine how to turn them into nicely worded exam questions. I also gave my students a framework for how to ask these questions in the first place by showing them Bloom's taxonomy. And I explicitly said, try to ask a question that is from the apply level or from the analyze level. And I gave them a couple of words that they could use to start out their questions. So for example, the word execute is something that you might put in a question for the apply level of Bloom's taxonomy. And at first we got like very strange questions. So I think somebody wrote something like probably execute a for loop. And I said, what does that mean? Is that a way that somebody would actually ask you a question? And of course they're trying to like force in these keywords into their questions in ways that don't make sense. But with a little bit of feedback from me, they were able to start actually writing questions that did have the spirit of the apply level without necessarily having to use the exact words that I gave them as potential proxies. There's one more aspect to this exam writing, which is my students are normally writing conceptual questions. It makes sense because the Cornell notes are about reflecting on the lecture material that they just saw in a video or read in a textbook. And so of course they're asking like the immediate response questions to those. So I told them, look, I'm not going to write a question like tell me the difference between a do while and for loop necessarily. It's a fine question, but maybe something that I would rather do is write an application question where I write a do while loop for them and then I ask them to transform it into a for loop. And what does that look like? So the exam questions that I wrote, I actually used code snippets, and then the questions would end up being something along the lines of what's wrong with the code that I wrote, or how do you write a code snippet that accomplishes this? Things like that. I did leave a couple other conceptual questions on there where I thought that they were really nice questions to have. So just a few conclusions that I have based on what I've seen so far. Students are writing good questions. Like from Cornell Notes 1 to Cornell Notes 3, I am impressed at the increase in fluency, the fact that they're naturally hitting all the levels of Bloom's taxonomy without me even explicitly telling them to do so anymore. But they still do have a little bit of trouble with writing code tracing and code writing questions, even as they're getting better at writing good conceptual questions. The other thing I noticed, students do score higher on the conceptual questions on exams than on code tracing and writing. So on the very same exam, where there are some questions that they wrote, which I left in their conceptual form, they did really well on. Makes sense, they wrote those questions. But the questions that I told them, hey, I'm going to turn this into a code tracing question or a code writing question, they're still scoring a little bit lower on that, even though they know that that's a particular topic that I'm going to write about, like the difference between a do while and while loop, something like that. For me, it was really nice because I wrote more diverse questions than I would have done otherwise, because my biases are going to go into question writing and exam writing, and I'd probably pick the topics that I think are most interesting or fun to write questions about. But here, I was able to at least see what they thought was important. So I was able to find also student misconceptions and topics that they thought were tricky. So for example, a lot of students were asking, what's the deal with the this keyword in Java? Enough questions were asked on multiple Cornell notes about that I decided, hey, I would like to put a question for you that utilizes the this keyword in some way because you're asking me about it. And the other thing, this doesn't even go on the exam, is it really makes me think about clearer explanations for topics that they do find tricky. So if I see the same question appearing on Cornell Notes, that is a question that I can answer in class and come up with a new explanation for. So for me, this was also important in terms of my stewardship of taking better care of my students because they were telling me what they needed to understand about the material. Going back to the first part of the talk where I was talking about Jimmy Carter, you could take this idea of taking care of yourselves and expressing what you need and then trying to get what you need in any aspect of your life. You could use it to achieve the highest office in this country. Or you could use it to improve the safety, security, and operations of a submarine. But of course, this is computer science, so let's think about some things that computer science students might see. And of course, as a cryptographer, care about security. So some students may just straight up want to have fun because they're interested in security. So that's something that they care about, and now they can learn these technical skills to help them play around with security in ways that they want. Some students might care about food insecurity, and so they might, if they end up as cryptographers, they might try to add unclonable labels to actual seeds, which is a real thing that's happening, and knowledge of cryptography is going to help you with that. Maybe some students just like math, and they're going to go into learning about things like Kolmogorov complexity. That's fine too. And the last example that I have on here is maybe you care about, again, that highest office in the land, but you want to make sure that the person that gets elected is really the person that deserves to have it. So maybe you care about election fraud. And that's the example that we're going to run with for the last section of this talk, which is then going to go into an actual teaching demo. So if we talk about e-voting, electronic voting, I'm going to start out with this assumption of this value that most of us care about fair and safe elections. So maybe the nice thing with having electronic voting is, look, every citizen of Estonia has an ID, which is good. And then now they don't have to go to a polling place. If they have a computer that has a smart card reader on it, they're going to just be able to vote from home. So in some sense, you could say, hey, this is going to improve the fairness of our elections because more people can participate than they would have done otherwise. So we don't actually have e-voting overall in the whole country, like the country of Estonia, but in general, lower level elections are also important. Congressional elections are also important, and there might be a trend towards seeing more of those e-voting processes in the future. I mean, besides the country of Estonia, there are some provinces in Switzerland, Norway, and not to mention non-governmental elections that are done based on being a member of a group. So supposing that this is something you care about, perhaps you would care about seeing if there are bugs or security problems in existing internet voting schemes, because you feel a stewardship, you feel a care towards making sure that voting is safe and fair for everybody. So basically, by taking security courses, and in general computer science courses, you learn the technical skills that you need that could be applied to improve the accountability, transparency, and security of the voting process. This is just one example of something that you could do with knowledge of computer science, with knowledge of security. Another way to word this is to say, oh, students can use their technical knowledge of cryptography to address real-world challenges in cybersecurity, because there are a lot more problems in cybersecurity than just voting. So in the next part of this talk, I'm going to bring up these characters of Alice, Bob, Callie, and David again, and talk about how they're going to be participating in a sub-algorithm that could be used in e-voting, and we'll talk about the actual techniques that go into that. For now, this is the end of my talk on my teaching philosophy. So thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the second part of this talk.